Good evening, everybody. I hope you're all comfortably squeezed in, if that's not an oxymoron. I'm Terry McCarthy. I run the Academy. Delighted you could all come tonight. We have a very full house, and I know we have some overflow in the library, so I hope you guys can hear us in the library as well. We're broadcasting remotely. For our event with Ben Rhodes, who has been busy all around Germany talking about his book, The World as It Is, which, as you know, is called Im Weißen Haus in its German translation. And we're delighted to be partnering on this event with the Beck Verlag, who have done a number of events with us in the past, and most recently with Timothy Snyder, also one of the authors. But without the Beck Verlag, this wouldn't have worked, so we're very grateful. Jonathan Beck is here. Welcome, with Eva Detig and Stephanie Hölscher from the Verlag. And I was there in December, visiting in Munich. And I have to say, I was saying this over lunch, I didn't meet a single person that hasn't worked there for at least 25 years. This is a fantastic publishing firm, and everyone seems to like it. So many more years of success there. We're also delighted to have David Meese from the US Embassy, sitting somewhere, sat him dinner. Welcome. And our guest tonight, Ben Rhodes. So he was speechwriter, Deputy National Security Advisor to President Obama for all 8 years, which is a lot. Most people get grey hair when they work that long in the White House.
Some of us just
he just took it off. So he did that. But we're delighted you're here to talk to us tonight. Maybe a few words first, and then we'll have a conversation, then we'll open up to the floor. Great. Ben Rhodes.
Well, I want to thank Terry for hosting me here at the American Academy. And, I've heard nothing but great things about Terry from some of our mutual friends, and nothing but great things about the American Academy since I first came to Berlin with Barack Obama in 2008 and met the then leader of the American Academy. I have to thank my publisher, or else I wouldn't be here. And it's really been an honor to bring this book to Germany, especially because Germany played kind of a unique, almost special role in the Obama presidency. I like to think of kind of bookends. When I set out to write this book, I realized I had a unique opportunity because it's very rare that somebody, starts the first day of a White House and leaves the last day, because all of my predecessors were much smarter than me, and realized it's not very good for your physical or mental health to do that. But it did allow me to tell, a complete story from beginning to end. And I kind of like to think of the bookends of this experience as the speech in Berlin that I worked on with then Senator Obama in July of 2008, when you had the explosion of excitement and anticipation at this new leader coming on the scene, captured in that brilliant audience that gathered to hear him speak. And then returning here in November of 2016 after the election for one final meeting with Angela Merkel, and being at the end of that journey, obviously under very different circumstances. So in many ways, this journey kind of began and ended for me here in Berlin. I'll just say a few words because it's always more lively to deal with things in conversation. And just because I wrote speeches for Barack Obama doesn't mean I can deliver speeches like Barack Obama. I worked on the Yes We Can speech in New Hampshire that became kind of iconic music video and everything. And sometimes people would be disappointed to learn that there was any speechwriter for this, that this didn't just emerge viscerally from inside of Obama. And I'd always say to them, that's true, but close your eyes and try to imagine me or John Kerry giving that speech. It wouldn't make any sense. The speech is the person who's giving it. The message works only if it's authentic to the person delivering it. And what's unique about Barack Obama is, and effective about Barack Obama as a politician, is that the speech he gave in 2004, that launched his political career at the Democratic Convention, is the same speech that he gave in his farewell address in 2017. His message didn't change. And in terms of how that applied internationally, he was governing at a time of immense change. In many ways, changes that had already begun before he took office. I remember, and I described in the book, on September of 2008, the night that Lehman Brothers collapsed and the economic crisis began, walking outside because I had to stay up all night to write a speech that he was going to give the next day about the economic crisis. And I was smoking because, you have to do something in that situation. And I saw our chief economic advisor outside, and I said, "How does it look?" And he said, "Well, there's a 50% chance that the entire global economy will collapse tonight. We'll know when the Japanese market opens." And I said, "Okay, I'm going to go smoke." But I make the point to say that, the promise, the hopes, the ambitions of the Berlin speech were already ended that moment. That the world we were going to be walking into, the politics that we were going to be walking into, were going to be dramatically reshaped. And as it applies to foreign policy, just to give some introductory comments that will probably frame the discussion here, Barack Obama saw the project of his 8 years internationally to be about repositioning the United States, recalibrating America's role in the world to adjust to a world that had changed, that the world that existed in the 90s, when institutions like this were emerging, when America was the dominant power in the world, not just the leading superpower, but completely dominant, that was always going to be a transitory moment, that if you look at human history, it's not sustainable for one power to be in that dominant of a position, that there was an inevitability to Russia trying to reassert itself and push back against that degree of dominance, to a China seeking to play a greater role commensurate of its size and wealth, and to a backlash against the forces of globalization that had been building already, and that after the financial crisis was going to get much more acute as people had lost their sense of personal economic security. And frankly, there had already been events that had accelerated that process. The American war in Iraq and the financial crisis had been two blows to the credibility of the United States as an unchallenged leader of the world. And so what Barack Obama was trying to do during his 8 years was to simultaneously draw down what he believed was an overextended American presence in wars abroad, the 180,000 troops that were in Iraq and Afghanistan, the trillions of dollars that had been spent on those efforts in the years prior to his administration, recognizing that that was an unsustainable allocation of resources, to try to reinvest in the foundation of American strength, which was our economy and the health of our economy, the health of our social safety net, the expansion of healthcare, but then to try to reimagine an international order that didn't discard the old one, but that built on the foundation of the existing international order. And I describe in my book all of these efforts that we pursued over many years to try to build on that foundation, to build a Paris Accord, a climate agreement, in which you don't just make agreements between the US and Europe and Japan like Kyoto, but you're bringing in all the countries in the world. You're bringing in China as a stakeholder and India as a stakeholder, and the very patient and methodical diplomacy that was required to get something like that done, and to create a model not just of an agreement that can deal with climate change, but that can be a model for how the world deals with other problems going forward. An Iran nuclear agreement that seeks to prevent another war in the Middle East while also upholding the principle of non-proliferation of nuclear weapons, that takes many years of sanctions, followed by many years of diplomacy, followed by a pretty brutal political fight at home that left me with some scars, so as to achieve a diplomatic agreement that can prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon and, again, avert another war. The Cuba negotiation that I was a part of, and I was a lead negotiator, and I describe in the book the secret negotiations over many months and many, many hours with the Castro family to reestablish diplomatic relations, but more importantly, to demonstrate that the United States could turn the page on a policy that had failed and that didn't make sense. And that in so doing, not just open up opportunities between the US and Cuba, but set a new tone for the United States around the world, in places like Latin America and places like Africa as well. And I could go on the list, but essentially an effort to sustain American leadership. And this was, I think, where some of the criticism of Obama was misguided. It was not an exercise in decline. It was an exercise in preventing that decline by, again, reinvesting in American strength at home and trying to create a series of international arrangements, agreements, forms of international cooperation that could extend and update the liberal order that we hold very dear. And obviously, we have a very different president now. And some people have said to me, well, aren't there similarities? Trump makes similar criticisms of international military engagements from the U.S., makes similar criticisms about the need for burden sharing. And I always say, well, yes, but it'd be like somebody making the same diagnosis about a patient, but having the opposite treatments for treating that illness. Whereas Obama saw the need for more diversity and inclusion and more equality economically and socially at home, and more international cooperation abroad, more international agreements abroad. Trump sees the opposite. He sees an us versus them exclusive form of politics at home and an isolationist approach that dismantles, literally, piece by piece, the international order so that the U.S. is unchained from international agreements and is unbound to either be isolationist or, at turns, belligerent in the international order. And so in some ways, it's a very diametrically opposed view of the world, both at home and abroad. There's something kind of clarifying about it. You know, there's Barack Obama's view and Donald Trump's view. And I've realized in thinking about this that they're an expression of two very different American stories. You know, Barack Obama used to always say to me, and I have this in my book, our entire job is to tell a story about America. That's what we're here to do. And he didn't just mean in speeches. He meant that everything that we did, how we carried ourselves, what our policies were, what our priorities were, how we treated other nations with respect, how we treated different populations with respect, and the words that we said all had to add up to a vision. And it was a vision of inclusion, and it was a vision of progress. It was a vision of cooperation. And there's always been that thread of progress. Barack Obama comes out of the tradition in American history of the progressive movement and the civil rights movement and the extension of rights to more people and the extension of a hand to other nations. And Donald Trump represents a very different view of American history. And if you think about it, America's always been a place of contradictions. A country that could have a Declaration of Independence that declares that all are equal while a portion of the population is enslaved. Those two stories in American history have always been there. And right now they're staring us right in the face. And, you know, one of the things that I describe in the book that got a lot of attention is after the election, on this final foreign trip, you know, we'd come to Germany, we'd seen Angela Merkel, spent a lot of time with her. We'd seen all these foreign leaders who could tell which way things were going. In many ways, it was much clearer to foreigners just how disruptive Trump was going to be than it was to Americans right away. One look at Angela Merkel's face could tell you that. And, you know, Obama said to me in the limousine ride to the airplane on our last trip, he said, you know, he'd read an article about how liberals had gotten too out of touch with people's desire for an identity, an ethnic identity, a religious identity, and he said, you know, what if we were wrong? What if people just want to fall back into their tribe? And what he meant by that was not, you know, what if we were wrong in what we believed? It's that sometimes progressives believe there's an inevitability to history, that we're just moving in one direction, that the inevitable direction of things is to greater progress, more inclusion, more peace among nations. You see that here in Europe, where there's been a taking for granted of the European Union, a taking for granted of the peace on this continent for the last 70 years and the standards of living that are enjoyed by people. And to me, and what he was obviously saying is Trump reflected the historical reality that, you know, this is always contested and there's always, you know, you take one step forward, a step back. This doesn't mean, however, that I think we're wrong. It means that this remains to be determined. The legacy of Barack Obama remains to be determined. The legacy of Angela Merkel remains to be determined. That there is a view of history that this pendulum could swing back in the other direction, and that 20 years from now, America is a much more progressive place and a much more inclusive place. And Barack Obama will appear to be someone who was at the forefront of a transition to a new kind of America and a different type of change. This could be reflected abroad, for all the attention on our successors' somewhat unusual fixation on things that Obama did. Many of those things could simply be regenerated under a future American president. Very likely that a future American president rejoins the Paris Climate Accord, for instance. On the other hand, if the wave of authoritarianism and populism prevails, if Trump and Brexit are not anomalies but are rather the new direction of things, then history will look very different. And we will have been wrong. And in that way, in writing this book about walking in the first day and walking out the last day, I had to come to realize that the story actually didn't end on the last day. It is still very much in play around us. So with that, I think that kind of frames some of the things I assume that we'll talk about. But I want to thank you for being here and thank those of you who read the book and encourage everybody to buy it and read it if you haven't. My publisher is here, and they will not publish my next book in German unless all of you help me. But with that, I will join the Q&A. Thanks very much.
Chancellor Merkel, you say in your book that she was there was no foreign leader that he admired more, and you do point out that she was the last one that he came to visit and asked her to stay on, given what was happening. You point to a very crucial time when the Russians had started to move into Ukraine, Crimea, and so on, and there was great anxiety in Europe. And who are you going to call? It was Angela Merkel. And there was a very, as I understand it, a series of very detailed discussions about how do we hold Europe together against this incipient Russian threat, because there were lots of different voices in Europe. How do we protest? I guess my concern is who's going to make that call today? And that level of, because it was not an easy diplomatic moment to keep Europe together. Who's going to make that call from the White House, and who's going to take it?
Well, Trump will make the call, and Putin will take it.
I was afraid you were going to say that.
Yeah. Sorry. No, I mean, that. I'll come back to that, but just to say why Angela Merkel was the call. And this gets at the uniqueness of their relationship. Over the course of the 8 years, where that partnership was really anchored was in issues related to Europe and Germany's leadership of Europe and Germany as an anchor in Europe. And it's hard to overstate. So much of the attention has been on obviously the subsequent events like Ukraine. But this begins in the financial crisis, and this continues through the Eurozone crisis, where really Angela Merkel is the decision maker. With all due respect to Nicolas Sarkozy, in part because there's then a French election and a transition in France, but Angela Merkel and Obama spent hours and hours together designing, stabilization packages for Greece, and we're prodding more action to try to stabilize the euro. She's navigating between, I think, some reluctance here to do too much to help those irresponsible Southern Europeans, but enough to save Europe. And what I think he identified, though, at that point is that if ever there was a moment when the viability of Europe was at stake, she would take the political risk. And this is an important thing to understand about Angela Merkel. She's a cautious, deliberate, pragmatic politician. But when there's a necessity to act in defense of the European idea, she can be a bold politician. And it's an interesting characteristic of her. And it's one that Obama admired, and it's one that is rooted in part in her upbringing in East Germany. And so we navigated the Eurozone crisis with her. And we navigated all manner of political crises in this turbulent time. And she'd also had a great deal of experience with Putin. And so I think what Obama and Merkel understood in 2014 is that, look, getting Russia out of Crimea was going to be incredibly difficult, if not impossible, absent going to war over this. There was a reality, a geographic reality. However, that if Europe did not demonstrate that, number one, there were going to be costs on Russia for that kind of violation of sovereignty, that if Europe and America did not demonstrate that, number two, there was going to be an extended hand to a government in Ukraine to at least be able to make their own decisions about the nature of their relationship with the EU. And then number three, there needed to be European unity, just in the face of what Russia was doing. The part of what Russia was doing was to sow disunity in Europe. That the response had to demonstrate those various elements, that cost imposed on Russia, that support for Ukraine, and that show of a united front, so as to preserve the core of Europe, even if it was going to be difficult to fend off Russia, particularly in Crimea, and to some extent in eastern Ukraine. And that took a lot of effort. And there's another case of Angela Merkel, when pushed, she could be bold. It was not easy to get Germany on board with certain actions and sanctions against Russia. It was certainly even harder to get the rest of Europe on board with that. And I think what's so disappointing to people today is your question, is that there's not an American president who would do that today. And there's not an American president who looks at the world. It's interesting. I know there was some hurt feelings here and I think misimpressions that in some cases were our fault. Obama would talk about Asia and people would hear that as an abandonment of Europe. But at the end of the day, I think people understood that Obama fundamentally cared about the Atlantic Alliance, about NATO, about Article 5, about the values that had guided the development of institutions, and about the fact that the U.S.-European relationship was the cornerstone of everything we did in the world. Some of these things I talked about. There's no Iran nuclear agreement without Europe. There's no Paris Accord without Europe. Just about everything we did that was not uniquely designed for other regions, we had to do with Europe. And Trump does not see the world that way. And that's an incredibly destabilizing fact. And I'm sure it's prompting debates here about what a more independent European foreign policy and defense policy looks like. But ultimately, in a world in which there are more actors and more centers of power, it actually becomes more important for the U.S. and Europe to cooperate. Mm-hmm. I could make an argument that it's as important, if not more important, than during the Cold War for the U.S. and Europe to cooperate. Because if you look out at this world, there's just not that many people that share a set of values and share a set of interests and share a set of perspectives about how the world should function. And to me, that's why what happens in the next American election and what happens in some of the upcoming European elections is so fundamental, because it's about whether we will continue to have that to depend upon or whether we won't. And again, what history shows is if you don't have those kinds of institutions and connections, there's always a conflict. That's the history of Europe. You don't avoid conflict without institutions and alliances and the capacity to work across borders to deal with challenges like the ones that took place in our presidency.
So you mentioned institutions. That conversation about what if we were wrong, which is, I think, an unanswered question and will be, as we were talking over dinner, until at least one more president has cycled through. But I think in that same conversation, Obama said, we're about to find out how resilient our institutions are. And I think that's the case not just in the United States, but I think we're starting to see that in Europe too, where various countries are going through various types of upheavals with populist nationalist parties, including here, where we have an extreme right-wing party in the Bundestag for the first time. How are we doing? I mean, certainly you could speak for the United States in terms of the resiliency of our institutions.
In the United States, it's a mixed picture. We have a fundamentally anti-democratic president. If it was up to him, there would not be constraints. There would not be independent rule of law. There would not be an independent media. I often like to think that what would I have been doing in office if the leader of a foreign country was engaged in the activities that Trump is? We'd be criticizing them and putting out concern, expressing in diplomatic language our deep concern over, the declaration that the press is the enemy of the state, and et cetera. And if you look at the institutions of American democracy, it's a varied picture. I think the judiciary has generally tried to stand up to Trump. The judges, the FBI, the Department of Justice have tried to preserve the independence of the rule of law. I think the media has been mixed. They try to stand up to him, but they haven't quite figured out how to deal with him, because they also allow him to direct the debate in the United States in ways that I think are uncomfortable. If Trump wants to talk about a caravan of dangerous people coming to the United States, even though that's not really the case, we spend a week talking about it because it's sensational. And so it's a mixed picture in some respects of the institution of our media, but generally holding. I think the institution that is fundamentally broken down, and I'm not going to surprise anybody, I'm a partisan Democrat here, but I think it factually bears out, is the Republican Party. There's really been no effort within the Republican Party to say that Congress has to be independent of the president and that certain behavior, will evoke censure. And that's kind of frightening to see a party kind of transformed into a far-right party instead of a center-right party, and kind of a cult of personality in ways that makes me uncomfortable. But to me, I think the institutions have held enough. And the ultimate check is the voters. In the last election, they chose a check. And the way I'd like to think about Trump is essentially that 4 years of this is survivable, and the institutions will be regenerated. But that 8 years of it, I don't think is. I mean, I think 8 years, presidents can make a lot more change in 8 years than 4. Your ability to change things at home and around the world goes up exponentially the longer you are there. And that's why I think this will be such a fundamental decision point, in American democracy. What is unknowable is just what the impact of this kind of evisceration of norms is and expectations. The basic expectations that people have for the office of the presidency and the functioning of government. That's an intangible that is eroding, that is concerning to me, and my hope is that too can be restored. And in Europe, I won't go on at length. I think here, the institutions are holding, but you see challenges mushrooming all over the place, inside of individual countries and across Europe. And you also see in Brexit kind of the failure of a certain ideology. My hope is that people will look at that and say, well, that doesn't make sense, that doesn't work, and that has an impact here in the politics of Europe. But that's not inevitable. And the thing I always say, especially to younger people, is that the other side of these debates is very well organized. They share common strategies across the Atlantic, the far right. They share common sources of financing, common media platforms, common political strategies. And frankly, if you care about these things, there has to be a similar level of organization and commitment on the other side of that debate.
So you mentioned younger people. There's an interesting passage in your book where the administration is deciding how to handle the Tahrir Square protests in Cairo. Mubarak is teetering, and clearly a U.S. support would mean one thing, a U.S. Thumbs down would mean another thing. And the president, as you describe it, is getting a lot of counsel from senior figures, the principals, as you call it, in the administration, a lot of whom want to preserve Mubarak, afraid of chaos. And he turns to you at one point and he says, I think in private, he says, Ben, you should speak up. You know how I think, and we are younger. And I thought that was quite striking. Striking, too, that we're in a time warp now. The current president is 20 years older than the guy who just left. Yeah. Talk a bit about that, this notion of we are younger.
Well, I think it was a combination of, the generational change that Obama represented. But also,
But he's talking to you.
He's talking to me.
He's surrounded by guys who are much older, right?
Yeah. And at the same time, the generational change that he represented had been tied very directly to the Iraq War. People forget that the 2008 primary was initially dominated by this question of who had supported the war and who had opposed it. And Obama had opposed it, Hillary Clinton, Joe Biden, everybody else basically on that stage had supported it and voted for it. And he looked at the Middle East, and you had essentially an order in the Middle East that was corrupted. You had a series of dictatorships across the region that were corrupt and unresponsive to the needs of the people. You also had, plop in the middle of the region, a U.S. invasion and occupation that had unleashed sectarian forces, competition with Iran, between Saudi Arabia and Iran and others. There was also kind of reshaping the politics of the region. And then here comes this event in Tunisia that spreads to Egypt, where people, ordinary people, are just seeking more responsive government. It was as much about corruption, I think, as democracy. Can we have governments that are somewhat responsive to our concerns? And the basic argument, I think, reflexively of a certain generation of American leaders is Mubarak equals stability. We know him, we know the military, we know the Saudis, and we have to back this. And our argument was not just some idealistic argument. It was actually also about stability. It was, no, the current status quo is inherently unstable. The reason there are hundreds of thousands of people in the street is precisely because it's unstable, because people are fed up with this. And therefore, we have to take the chance of breaking with Mubarak to at least test the proposition as to whether or not something more responsive in terms of governance can emerge in Egypt and hopefully provide some example for the region. And ultimately that was the view that Obama took. He did say something interesting to me, and this gets at the personal relationships involved with foreign policy. After he had kind of broken with Mubarak, he also pointed out to me that Hillary and Biden and many other people were friends with Mubarak. And he said, Ben, I don't know if I could have called King Abdullah of Jordan and suggested to him that he had to step down, which is a very human thing. So part of this also was just the human relationships that guide much of foreign policy. Sometimes I wanted the book to show, people make foreign policy. It's not some amorphous set of faceless institutions. And so that was just one interesting self-aware caveat to that dramatic decision.
So another interesting part in the book, and this has been written by many different people from many different perspectives, but that decision whether or not to go into Abbottabad, it's quite clear that there was no certainty. There were these different percentages, 80%, 20, 60, 40, 51, 40. Everyone's giving their, maybe it is the tall pacing guy, maybe he's not knowing them. And you talk about this, about how he asked everyone their opinion, and yet you say that you kind of felt he'd already made up his own mind. Can you talk about that? Because that's interesting.
Yeah, so, I get brought into this incredibly secret process. I remember being brought into these meetings, and told we might know where bin Laden is. And it was actually the closest I've ever come to government being like it looks in the movies. Because you'd start with these kind of mysterious intelligence briefings. There's a compound, there's 3 families who live there. They match the age and gender of bin Laden and his wives and children. They take extraordinary precautions to not reveal their identity. They burn their trash outside. And I'm literally getting briefed every time they burn their trash, which felt like some John le Carre, miniseries. And there's one man that never comes out of the compound. Every now and then he paces back and forth in this courtyard. I mean, this is good stuff, right? And, a lot of the debate then focused on how much do we know this is bin Laden or not? And then a lot of the debate then became, do we destroy this compound just with an airstrike, or do we launch a special operations raid? And Obama decided pretty early, if we do this, we have to do the special operations raid, because we have to know it's him. You know, you can't just blow something up and hope that it was bin Laden. So in this final meeting, he went around the room, and first there's this long debate about what are the percentage. The CIA had calculated with 70% assurance that this was bin Laden. But then there was a red team of other analysts that they brought in who said, no, it's only 40%. And you could kind of tell that, you know, some people were saying, well, if we can come down on 60, I'll be for it. But, you know, if it's 40, I won't, right? And Obama cuts off this discussion. He says, no, look, it's 50-50, right? Like, because he may be there, he might not be there. But we do know it's the best lead we've had, right? So we know that. And he goes around the room, though, and asks everybody's opinion. And it was very split. The Secretary of Defense was against doing this. And not only was he against it, he raised the specter of Jimmy Carter's operation in Iran, Desert One, and the crashing helicopters. And as soon as he said it, I thought, oh, God, we're going to do that. This is what's going to happen. And then there'll be an anecdote in the press. You know, Obama was warned. But then, you know, it's basically mixed. The room is 50-50. You know, Vice President is against it. Hillary Clinton is cautiously for it. Obviously, CIA director is for it. And it's all over the map. But I'm looking at Obama, and, you know, I could tell he was going to do this because, you know, it was interesting. We had this whole series of fights in the primary about foreign policy. And the two biggest issues were he had said he'd go into Pakistan to get bin Laden, and he was criticized for that. And he said he'd negotiate with Iran over the nuclear issue, and he was criticized for that. And, you know, I'd seen him dig in on that position, and I knew that, you know, the thing about Obama is he's a fairly deliberate, like Angela Merkel, politician. But he takes calculated risks. And I think he knew this is the best shot we're ever going to have to get bin Laden. And that getting bin Laden was important to the psychology of the country as well as to our security. The 9/11 wars are not ending well. You know, Afghanistan and Iraq are not going to end well. And this capacity to remove bin Laden is the closest thing we're going to get to some sense of justice for this event, some degree of closure around at least the core of the event, even as it spawned, you know, 1,000 other problems. And you know, sure enough, the next day he says, you know, let's do this.
You say in the book that you had to write 4 different speeches for 4 potential outcomes, successful. I mean,
yeah,
that's kind of hard.
So I was directed to write 4 speeches and also just 4 kind of sets of points that people could use publicly after this operation. One is that we go all the way there and bin Laden's not there and we just leave. And someone finds out about it and we have to explain why we flew an hour and a half into Pakistan. It was that was a hard one to do. And the second one is we go all the way there, and bin Laden's not there, and it's like a disaster. There's a firefight. You know, we confront the Pakistani military. I mean, this was a really unpleasant one to do. Then, of course, there were basically 2 versions of the better version of that. You know, it's difficult. There's a firefight. Bad things happen, but bin Laden is there. And then the kind of clean, you know, we get out. And I will say that I came to the one of getting bin Laden cleanly, and I started to write it, and I was like, I can't write this. I will jinx this.
Really?
Yeah, I didn't. So I didn't write that speech. So actually, it happens, and we have the operation, and we're in the Situation Room all day, and then Obama comes in, and we have to make this decision about whether to announce that this has happened.
And you hadn't written the speech.
Well, yeah, and it was interesting because it was like, how can we establish that this is definitely bin Laden? And we knew pretty well because when the troops were there, people were yelling, Sheikh Osama, you know, and then he's the same height as bin Laden, and he looks like him. And it was interesting. We came back to the base in Afghanistan. They actually didn't have a tape measure. So to make sure he's the same height as Obama, they took a guy Osama. I'm not Trump here, guys. To make sure he's the same height. They had a guy who was the same height as bin Laden lie down next to him. And I said, look, that's not going to be good enough. But then they did a facial recognition analysis that the CIA can do, and it came back, yes, this is him. And so Obama says, okay, we have to announce this tonight. Notify the networks. And I'm sitting there thinking, well, I didn't write that speech. So I write that speech in basically an hour and a half. And actually, I've now seen it 100 times because it's at the opening of Homeland. And so every time I see, we can and must remain vigilant at the credits of Homeland, I'm put back into this place where I hadn't written the speech. But it was the most satisfying moment, or one of the most satisfying moments I've had in government, as horrible as it is to say that about the killing of somebody. Mainly because, as I described in the book, I had gotten into politics and foreign policy because of 9/11. I'd witnessed those attacks. I'd worked on the September 11th Commission. I'd gotten to know many of the families who'd lost loved ones. And again, I did recognize it in a world that provides no reward. That this is the closest, as I said, we're going to come to some measure of justice, closure, whatever you want to describe it as. And I remember walking back with Obama after he gave his remarks down the colonnade in the Rose Garden of the White House. And you could hear these cheers, even though the street is far away. And it was this kind of eerie, powerful feeling to hear this kind of pent-up expression from people in the streets in the middle of the night after he made that announcement.
That was a gutsy decision, as you say. He took a risk. You also talked in your book about how there was constant criticism of not doing enough, specifically in military terms, even though there was the war in Afghanistan and Yemen and Somalia and all the drone strikes. And there's a great quote you have from somebody who's unnamed, but sitting in some meeting, getting frustrated and saying, "You've got to bomb something." Yeah. Generic, just just go out and blow stuff up.
Yeah.
Talk a bit about that.
Yeah. Well, the obviously it's tied to Syria, right?
Yeah.
And I went through this evolution that I described in the book, from Egypt, which I talked about, feeling hopeful about this. Libya, I was in the group of advisors who thought it was right to go in and stop Gaddafi. And that ultimately led to a military intervention that led to the removal of Gaddafi. But then, the descent into some degree of chaos in Libya. And in Syria, throughout 2012 and 2013, I had been arguing for us to intervene in Syria militarily. There are two anecdotes I give in the book to get at some of the creeping doubts. One is I wanted to persuade Obama to do this. This is before the chemical weapons incident. And I had a bunch of journalists in from the Middle East, and I thought that if he listened in an off-the-record way to the unvarnished tragedy in Syria, that it would compel him to feel as I did, that we had to do something. And sure enough, they painted this picture of enormous complexity, of proxy wars in Syria between all the different actors in the region, and the fractured opposition that included Al-Qaeda and what became ISIS, as well as people who were just trying to throw off the yoke of the regime, and Hezbollah, and Alawites and Christians who were worried about being massacred themselves, and Iran, of course, and Hezbollah and Russia, and the desperation of people caught in this. And after it was done, I remember following Obama to the Oval Office and feeling like, well, what did he think? And what was interesting is where I had heard a call to action, he'd heard the opposite. He had heard that this was a place of vast complexity that we couldn't affect just through military strikes. And I remember him saying to me, we have to start learning. We had 150,000 troops in Iraq, and people were still killing each other. We removed a dictator in Libya, and people are now killing each other there today. That there's not a direct correlation between the use of American force and the improvement of the political or humanitarian situation, that it's more complicated than that. And that Syria is even more complicated than Iraq or Libya was. It's more of a petri dish of proxy wars and sectarian conflict. That was his mindset. And I also described being in meetings and, recognizing my own shortcomings here. Like, I'm not a military expert, I know that, right? But I, like a lot of people, had been involved in American Middle East policy for, even though I was young, for 15 years at that point. And and it would get to me, and I'd say, we have to do something. And he'd say, well, what should we do? And kind of drawing on the, the conventional, I think, view, I said, well, blow up the runways where Assad's planes take off to carry out these attacks on civilians. And he'd say, okay, Ben, and what do I do the next day when they rebuild the runways? And his point was always that if we're going to be intellectually honest about it, a limited military intervention was not going to change anything. That Assad was going to fight to the death. He had the support of external powers. That we would have to actually remove Assad ourselves to stop him from killing his people. And that even if we removed Assad ourselves, that you would still have violence. And we'd be there as we've experienced in Iraq and Afghanistan and Libya. And that there was no public support for that in the United States after those wars, right? Of course, all this comes to a head in the Red Line debate, which I kind of painstakingly and painfully recreate in this book, where after this horrific incident, I think, we're finally going to do this. We're going to bomb Syria. And over the course of several days, there's this kind of strange retrenchment at home and abroad, where abroad, the British Parliament votes to literally prevent Britain from joining us in any military action in Syria. Chancellor Merkel says she can't even offer political support until a UN investigation and the UN process plays out. The French are the only country prepared to join this. There's obviously no international legal basis. And at home, Congress starts warning Obama. During Libya, they had started to issue warnings. This is not constitutional, this military action in Libya. And we actually had to curtail the military operation so that we could claim that it was constitutional. Obama decides, look, I know, if I'm looking in my own heart and head, that if I just take one cruise missile strike, nothing will change. And therefore, that this is probably the beginning of a more sustained military intervention. And that I cannot sustain that military intervention absent any basis at home, any legal basis, any political basis. And I also don't feel confident that it is likely to succeed. But I'm going to go to Congress and test whether or not I can get authorization for this action so that I at least know that I am on a foundation, a legal foundation and a political foundation that can allow me to do this. And of course, he doesn't get that support. But to be, it does kind of confirm what he already believes, which is that after Iraq and Afghanistan and Libya, there was both a substantive and political reason to doubt our capacity to shape events inside of Syria. And the explosion of criticism that followed, that kind of continues to this day, the purest manifestation of it was that this exchange where I went to meet with some experts this kind of ended up being the distillation of a certain view, like you have to bomb something. And to me, I had already confronted my own doubts and evolved in my own thinking. I had come into office with kind of a view of the world that embraced a kind of liberal interventionist, humanitarian interventionist view of military power. But I had to reckon with the fact that I couldn't find what the evidence was that there was some direct correlation between bombing something and things getting better in the place that we bombed the country. And I draw the parallel in the book to my experience kind of eerily in Laos towards the end of the administration. I got very involved in trying to clean up the 80 million unexploded ordnance that are still in Laos. That can far more than were dropped on Germany and Japan combined in World War II, that are still killing children today, kind of in the ultimate example of the unintended consequences of bombing something to preserve your credibility. Mm-hmm. Nixon had a red line in Laos too, and he acted on it. And so to me, I was just trying to show the complexity. Not that we were definitely right, frankly, but just that 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 you have to at least wrestle with the fact that there are always unforeseen consequences. I thought Libya was going great when we intervened. We stopped the massacre in Benghazi. We ultimately removed a dictator who was unquestionably a terrible guy. But look at Libya today. And so I can't. I have to learn from that. And my critique of the American foreign policy establishment that got me into some hot water later is that there's not a learning process. There's not an internalization of, this didn't work, so let's think again, right? And I wanted to kind of show the sides of that.
And there's a poignancy here too, and we talked about this over dinner, that you, as a communications guy, which is what you are, you knew that this was going to play really badly. That the red line had been declared and then it wasn't enforced. And yet, intellectually, the argument was, well, X number of Tomahawk missiles isn't going to change anything.
Yeah, and it's been a fascinating experience, even in the last few days, because, and I'm not saying this to absolve myself, but part of what happened to me is in 2014 and 15 and 16, nobody wanted to go out and talk about our Syria policy, because who wants to talk about such an awful humanitarian catastrophe? And so I had to go out and kind of communicate this. And it kind of became, it's funny, I started to see myself described as the architect of our Syria policy, when I really wasn't. I was just a spokesperson for our Syria policy, I started to take a lot of heat for that, and it was kind of like me and Obama were the last two human beings alive who would go out and explain this. And, even throughout this trip in Europe, everywhere I go, of course, the first question is, don't you regret this horrible decision that was made on the red line? And I know that the easy thing to say is that, well, I actually argued in the Situation Room to bomb Syria, and if only they listened to me, everything would have been different, right? And that's actually what most political memoirs are like. It's, I was right about everything, and the good things that worked out were because I recommended them, and the bad things that happened were because if only they'd listened to me, it would have been different. But I feel like that would be intellectually dishonest. I mean, I really did change. And I will, to be honest, in this room, I mean, maybe I changed because of necessity. Maybe I had to kind of get with the program. But I think it was deeper than that. I had to confront the limits of what America could achieve inside of other countries. Countries, particularly in the Middle East, that have huge fault lines running underneath them, fault lines of religion and sect and colonialism, and acknowledge limits. And again, I think one of the reasons why Obama was so controversial in those last couple of years, even as we're putting up some of our biggest successes in foreign policy, the Iran deal and Paris and TPP and Cuba, is because it's very rare for an American president to acknowledge limits. But I think it's also very important, because if you refuse to acknowledge limits, that's how you get Vietnam, and that's how you get Iraq. And so I was hoping that I could at least do my part to initiate a debate. And maybe all I did is initiate a lot of attacks that came my way. But it's interesting when I travel around the United States. Young people will come up to me and say, that was really interesting. So I think, again, generationally, there may be a bit of a split here.
Just one more question, and then I'll open it up. I want to talk about race. You said that it's important to confront limits, acknowledge limits. And you say in your book that Obama would be the last person who would have thought that he could have solved racial tensions, racial discrimination in the United States. But then came Charleston. 9 African Americans shot in their church while they're worshiping by a white guy. And he goes down to the funeral several days later of, I think, the person who was leading the...
Well, everybody, actually.
Yeah, but there was
Clementa Pinckney was the
exactly.
pastor, but it was his memorial service, but everybody had been killed in the church. Yeah.
Exactly, 9 were dead, but the funeral was
Clementa
for Clementa Pinckney, right? And so he stands up, and he's standing up on the... And some of you might have seen this. He's standing up on the altar, and there are a whole bunch of pastors behind him all in purple. And he's riffing on grace, talking about amazing grace. And then he sort of pauses for a moment, and he starts to sing it. And that's the most extraordinary moment. I find it very hard to watch without choking
I
up.
can't watch it without crying, yeah.
You know, I looked at it tonight, and it's on multiple channels. One of the channels I looked at had already got 5.7 million views, and I'm sure that's...
It's small, actually, yeah.
I'm sure that if you go to other channels, you get another, X million. Did he make some contribution? Would he think himself that he was able to contribute? Because we now have somewhat aggravated racial relations in our country, but was that for naught, or did he achieve something there? Because
he did.
That's there. That document is always there.
He did. I'll start with the bad and then end with the good. The racial animus directed at Obama was vastly understated. I think the news media and a certain segment of the American population did not want to confront how obvious the racism was. I relate kind of a dark joke that Obama used to use. We'd be preparing for a press conference, and I'd say, well, you could be asked, is the extreme opposition you're facing in the Republican Party rooted at all in racism? And he'd say, yes, next question, but he'd never say that publicly. And the main reason why is that, he learned early on that if he said anything about race, early in the administration, some of you won't know this because I don't know how big this is in Germany, but a very prominent Harvard professor, Henry Louis Gates, was arrested in his home by a police officer for no reason. That he saw a black man going to this nice house, and he went in and arrested him. And Obama said that was stupid. And this became a scandal. And it was all anybody talked about for 2 weeks. And actually, Obama's poll numbers fell more after that than at any time in his presidency.
Really?
Yep. And he realized that if he started talking about race, it's all they would talk about. He couldn't talk about healthcare. It would just become this distraction. And that he was going to be Jackie Robinson. Jackie Robinson didn't talk about being black. He just did a really good job and showed that a black person could do a really good job and could carry himself with more dignity than his white antagonists. I think that was his mentality, But again, I was disappointed by the extent to which people avoided the obvious truth. I mean, Donald Trump constructed an entire political brand over many years on one idea. The idea that the first black president was born in Africa. And sometimes I'll call Donald Trump a racist, and people say, really, you really think he's racist? And I'd say, well, what else is that? How else would you describe a person saying that the first black president is born in Africa? During the 2016 election, a majority of Republicans polled continued to believe that he was born in Africa. What is that, if not racism? The notion that he's illegitimate somehow. And Americans don't want to, confront that because that's awkward, right? So the downside, the dark side is that whenever there's a racial barrier that is broken in America, there's always a backlash. There was a backlash to emancipation. It was called Jim Crow. There was a backlash to the civil rights movement. There was a backlash to busing. There was a backlash to Barack Obama. Now, where I find hope is what he always knew, the key to the racial barrier is that black children would see themselves differently after he was in the Oval Office. And that, frankly, some white children would see black children differently after he was in the Oval Office. That the hope is with younger people. And if you look at the Democrats who just got elected to Congress, they look like an Obama 2008 campaign rally. They are black, they are Muslim, they are Latino, they are Native American, they are Asian, they are young, they are progressive. That's his legacy. If you look at the people running for president, Kamala Harris, Cory Booker, Joaquin Castro, people running, by the way, not just who are diverse, but who are much more forthright than Obama in talking about their racial identity. Obama never used to talk about it. Cory Booker and Kamala Harris, in their announcements, talk about at length the civil rights movement and what it means to them to be black. And so that's the hope. And that's why I actually do believe that we weren't wrong, that ultimately the direction of things is where Obama was pointing. It's just going to be really hard to get there and take some time.
Constantine has a microphone. Please put up your hand. We'll get to you. The gentleman right here in the middle.
Thank you. Malcolm Jorgensen from the Berlin Potsdam Research Group. I have a question about how the Obama administration's foreign policy might be thought of in historical terms relative to the long ideas that have shaped America's behaviour in the world. So one theme that emerges from reading your book is the idea that seeing the world as it is one way of getting away from ideology, and these ideologies that might have led America astray in the past. But interestingly, in Obama's 2016 interview for The Atlantic, he was also asked this question about history and how about historians might think about his foreign policy. And it was said there that he drew out a 4-part grid of 4 ways of thinking about foreign policy, such as interventionism, realism, and then he tried to place himself from there. So my questions are, first of all, could you shed some light on where that way of thinking came from? Was this some way that the administration thought about foreign policy? And then secondly, how would you place the Obama administration's foreign policy in historical perspective relative to these ideas, some of which go back to the founding of the Republic? Thank you.
Yeah, well, first of all, the title of The World as It Is, is cribbed from an Obama phrase that he used sometimes, apparently including on his first date with Michelle Obama, which is a whole other story. But you have to see the world as it is to pursue the world as it should be. So it's not a nakedly realist statement. It's actually, to be an idealist, you actually have to first confront reality to get to the outcome you're seeking. I think that the way I like to think about Obama, what's interesting about him in terms of his worldview that informs his foreign policy, is that he understood the good that America could do in the world. It's in his DNA. Interestingly enough, like his grandfather was in Patton's army, and his great-uncle helped liberate Buchenwald. He himself, as an African-American, he only exists because America brought, in an exchange program, his father from Kenya to study in an American university. So that kind of soft power and that attraction of America is in his DNA. At the same time, he lived in Indonesia as a boy, right after a CIA-backed coup led to bloodletting that killed 500,000 people, right? The unintended consequence of an American action in the world. And so I think rather than just realism and idealism, it's an effort to navigate between the necessity of American leadership in the world, that absent America, there's no other force in the world that can be the connective tissue between institutions that we build and values that we care about. And Obama understood that. He understood that in a vacuum, that things can fall apart. Things fell apart in Kenya, after independence because of the lack of institutions, right? So he understood the need for American action and American leadership, but he also understood that sometimes that doesn't mean that everything we do is right. American exceptionalism to him doesn't mean that if we do it by definition, it's the right thing to do, that we've made huge mistakes and we have to acknowledge them. And this debate about American exceptionalism, which ties to American foreign policy, is actually a relevant one. When Obama would cite mistakes we've made in the past, people would say he was apologizing for America. But in fact, he always framed it as America is uniquely capable of learning from our history and improving our actions in the world. so it's a long way of saying that on this continuum, yes, there are elements of realism, there are elements of idealism, and there are elements of intervention, and then there are elements of restraint. And he really was right in the middle of those things, because his point was, we have to be idealists, but we have to do so with open eyes about what we can affect in the world and what we can't. And we have to be willing to act, and he was willing to act diplomatically and militarily in lots of circumstances. But if I think that I don't know that my action can produce a good result, I don't want to repeat the mistakes of the past. So he's kind of right in the middle of those poles. I will say something interesting about legacy, though. And I thought about this at the end when I anticipated that our successor would come in with like a sledgehammer and start hacking away at our legacy. I thought about presidents that I admired on foreign policy. And my hero had been John F. Kennedy growing up. And I realized that I wasn't even alive, obviously, when Kennedy was president. And I realized that even sitting here today, I couldn't really name for you the scorecard, the Iran deal, TPP, the Paris Accord for John F. Kennedy. The Peace Corps is great. He navigated the Cuban Missile Crisis well, but that wasn't the thing that appealed to me about John F. Kennedy. It was the feeling he gave people. It was, the speech he gave here in Berlin. The motivation he left billions of people to imagine that things could change. Things could change in America. Things could change around the world. That created changes that are still playing out in the world today. That somehow led me, actually, to serve in the Obama administration in its own way. And I know that's maybe I'm rationalizing Trump, but I actually do believe that there are certain historical figures who their legacy becomes somewhat divorced from even their policies. And so, yes, on the continuum, he tried to carve out this kind of pragmatic center between the poles that have dominated these debates. But I actually think in the longer run, his impact 40 years from now will be measured more by who he was, what he represented, the things he said, the people he motivated, than any single policy that people are looking back.
So this gentleman here had his hand up first, and then we've got two in this row.
Thank you for your talk. In my perspective, you delivered a very friendly picture of the Obama era, not to say an idyllic picture, especially during your introduction. Do you see any problems and inner contradictions which led to the stage we are in now? I guess some of the inner contradictions are responsible for a figure like Trump. Trump didn't came from nowhere, and it's not only a terrible mistake of the voters that Trump is the president now.
Yeah, I think that you can't understand Trump without understanding the kind of radicalization that took place in the Republican Party over the course of 10 or 20 years. And I try to trace this evolution in the book between things that used to be kind of underneath the surface and then were mainstream when Sarah Palin becomes vice president, and then find expression in the Tea Party. And then by the time Trump comes down that escalator, he was the front runner from day one, and he never trailed in the Republican primary. I mean, that's the extent to which this political party had become transformed. And to blame Obama for that, I think is...
It's not a question of blaming.
Well...
It's a question of political analysis.
Okay. I mean, I would say the most offensive thing about Obama to those voters is that he's black. And there's nothing Obama could do about that. And I also think, just on the narrow political analysis, the reason I cite the thing about the Republican Party is that Donald Trump got less votes for president than Mitt Romney got. And Obama won in a landslide against Mitt Romney, right? So there wasn't this huge shift in public opinion prompted by Obama. The people who voted, this is why who the Republican nominee is, I think is more important than anything Obama did. Because essentially the Republicans didn't gain a vote share. The Democrats just lost a lot of votes. And I think they lost a lot of votes because Obama wasn't on the ballot. I mean, I think Obama has, and look, sometimes, in an effort to analyze, the key issue is who are the candidates, and Hillary Clinton was, as much as I admire her, just not a very popular candidate, and she lost, and it's as simple as that. And so to me, the more important fact is, how did Donald Trump become the nominee of the Republican Party? Because that's what's extreme, right? Not necessarily, not anything else, really. And so to be self-reflective and self-critical, we made mistakes. Barack Obama should have invested more in building up the Democratic Party while he was president, I believe, right? The DNC kind of atrophied, the Democratic National Committee. There wasn't effort put into elevating new voices in the party enough. So we were left with just Obama and Hillary and Bernie Sanders. Failures. So I am saying that there were failures on our side, in preparing for that election, in making sure we had the strongest candidate and strongest message. We should have foreseen the difficulty Hillary Clinton would have after 30 years of Republican attacks and scandals. All that is true. But again, I think you can misread the result as some massive shift, when in fact it was just a situation where they beat our candidate with even less votes than they got the time before, and it happened to be that their candidate was much more extremist because their party had changed. And so people go, and I know it's interesting. I come to Europe, and it's almost like more fascination with, so many journalists I've met here have been to West Virginia, and I have to tell you that those people have never voted for Democrats. That it's not new that rural white voters vote Republican. If anything, we lost some swing voters in the suburbs. Some, basically middle-aged white women voted in higher levels for Trump than we anticipated, right? So again, I say this again to say that you can overanalyze these results and overlearn the lessons. You need a good candidate. You need a good message. You need to take care of the institutions of your party. You need to compete everywhere. You need to show up everywhere. You need to talk to voters even if they disagree with you. And you need to treat them with respect. And that's what Obama did. And clearly that didn't happen in 2016. And because the other party becomes so radicalized, the person who therefore benefited from that was an extremist in Donald Trump. That's my analysis. You don't have to agree with it, but I think, I think you can, there's a risk at overinterpreting what was a not necessarily a huge shift in American public attitudes.
Thank you. This gentleman here and gentleman there, and then we're looking down at the back too. We're not giving up on you guys. Yeah, there's a couple down at the back also.
When Obama was speaking out against Brexit, did he ponder the possibility that it might backfire? Had he been encouraged by European leaders to speak out?
Yeah, no, we did. It's a good question. And we basically put it to Cameron. We said, it's up to you. You tell us. If you want us to come, we'll come. If you don't want us to come, we won't come. And it was his judgment that he needed us to come. And maybe that backfired. It very well may have. Maybe it was a wash. Maybe it didn't. I don't know. I do know that what's interesting about Cameron's decision in having us come, which Cameron explained to us at the time, by the way, which is really interesting, is that the Remain campaign had no spokesperson, really. Cameron was not necessarily the perfect spokesperson for that, because his own party clearly was for Brexit. So he was kind of isolated on this island where he was arguing for Remain, but most of his party was against it. Meanwhile, the Labour leader is Jeremy Corbyn, who I think doesn't seem that enthusiastic about remaining in the European Union, let's put it that way, right? And at a minimum was not a full-throated campaigner for Remain. So you had this kind of bizarre situation where even though both Corbyn and Cameron were for Remain, neither of them made for natural spokespeople. Cameron's decision, therefore, was to try to bring in as many people as possible, right? So bring in Obama, bring in business people, bring in everybody you could get, have celebrities do things. And that may have been wrong. But that was his calculation, and I think it's interesting. It shows, how much, political leadership matters at the end of the day. And there was no leader of the Remain campaign, and ultimately I think that doomed it relative to the Brexit campaign, which had a much simpler message to deliver.
There's a gentleman there, and then we'll go back.
Hi. You talked a little bit about how you were drawn to JFK because of his vision, and I guess. Okay, sorry.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So just to reiterate, you talked about how JFK, his vision, kind of drew you to him, and this American dream, I guess, from seen from a European standpoint at least. It seemed for a long time that the American dream was kind of the U.S. strongest export. And Obama, I think, very much sold a version of that everyone was kind of lining up to buy. It seems the world we're left with right now, though, is very, very far from that. That basically America does not have a dream to sell right now. And what America is trying to sell, the world ain't buying.
You're not buying Make America Great Again?
So for someone who came up looking up to Kennedy and watching Obama, how does that make you feel that American dream no longer exists and no one is willing to buy it? Do you agree?
Yeah. No, I totally agree. But I think that to decide that it's all over, right, because of the situation we're in, to me, is a very un-American thing. Look, we've had, a civil war. We've had segregation. We've had the Vietnam War. We've had a lot of ugliness in our history. It's not all soaring. And the only reason we got past that is because people decided, no, this is not us. We're that dream. And again, my hope is that we could be sitting here in 2 years and things are different. And it feels like someone is out there selling the right idea again. Now, here's what I also know. When I travel around the world, what I hear is not just concern that Donald Trump is president. It's concern that Donald Trump could be elected by America. And so I also know that just electing a new person is not going to erase the doubts that have been created around the world. Because it's not about one man, it's about, well, how could this guy get elected, right? And again, my view of how this happened, and it was reflected a bit in that last exchange, but I admit it's a partisan view, but it's a political party lost. It got to a point where Donald Trump could be the nominee of that party, right? And that there was a breakdown in the antibodies that prevented things like that from happening. And I could sit here and give you a lot of reasons why that happened. The changing nature of the media, social media, and Fox News Channel, and people being able to live inside of hermetically sealed bubbles, et cetera, all that. But to more directly just answer your question in a shorter way, I think America, like I said, has always been two stories and a competition, and it's not always just been the positive story. And what I feel very good about in America is, if you ask how institutions have done, I actually think people have done even better than institutions. People have been active and organizing, and every single person I know who got elected to Congress, and I know a bunch of them, would not have run if Donald Trump wasn't president. They weren't thinking that they'd be politicians, right? And so I actually do think that there's this regeneration happening from within in response to Trump. And if that can prevail, it won't solve all of our problems, but it will begin to solve those problems. And we will need to reintroduce ourselves to the world for a long time, and through more than one election cycle. Because you're sitting there thinking, well, if these people elected Donald Trump once, they could do something like that again, right? And they're thinking, if I'm Germany, the reason I made a bet on America for everything, for our security and our foreign policy orientation is not because we agreed with all their foreign policies. You frankly didn't. It's because you fundamentally thought we were a stable democracy that was oriented in the right direction. And we have to kind of demonstrate that over time. But I think that is the most likely outcome. I mean, I think that the direction of America, the demographics of America, the energy that we see now is pointing in the direction away from Make America Great Again. It's in what we just saw in the congressional election. I could be wrong. And if I'm wrong, I've got a lot bigger problems than just the fact that I'm wrong. But I'm telling you, and this matters here, Trump and the Brexiteers and the far-right party here, they need people to give up and to become cynical. Like, that's the only way they win, right? And that's what happened in 2016. Young people didn't vote because they said, I don't really like Hillary, and screw it. And again, that's why I have no choice but to say, no, that vision is right, and we have to fight for it again, and hopefully, be sitting here years from now and talking about the new version of what people admire about America.
We got a couple in the back. I think we got time for two more. Can you get right in the back, Konstantin? Thank you.
Hi there. Sorry, but I do want to press a bit on this point about where you think things might have played out differently from especially the economic policies, because in Europe there's obviously the discussion that the current rise of nationalism, populism, especially in Southern Europe and maybe also France and UK, is a long consequence of the 2008 financial crisis. So I was wondering whether you think, obviously stabilizing the system after the crash was the absolute essential thing to do, but after that, do you think the administration could have done anything differently to mitigate the consequences for people and then maybe have a different outcome in the last elections?
Well, I completely agree with the analysis that the financial crisis is the root of the populism. That again, if you remove dramatically people's sense of personal economic security, their savings are taken away, their jobs are taken away, the sense of predictability that their children are going to have opportunities is taken away, that the appeals to nationalism and race and ethnicity, that's the environment in which those appeals are potent. In terms of what we could have done differently, again, the difficult part with this is in the first 2 years, we did an extraordinary amount. There's $1 trillion stimulus bill that includes all kinds of job-creating initiatives and infrastructure investments and clean energy investments and tax cuts. There's a healthcare bill to expand the safety net. There's Wall Street reform to prevent the financial industry from repeating the excesses that led to the crisis. There's an Equal Pay Act. I could go on down the list. I can tell you that over the next 6 years, absolutely we would have liked to have done a lot more. And we introduced infrastructure spending bills, and we introduced a Jobs Act, and the Republican Congress would never pass it. And I don't know what else to say other than Mitch McConnell arrived at a brilliant insight, which is that if you make Washington dysfunctional and unable to respond to people's problems, people tend to blame the president, right, or the party in power in some fashion. Now, the reality is they tried that strategy in 2012, and Obama still won, because Obama is still very popular in the United States. And frankly, his highest approval rating in his 8 years was at the end of his presidency, like right before the election. So the bizarre thing, again, about all this is that people kind of didn't blame Obama personally, but they were frustrated, and so they were more receptive to someone who looked more like change. And Hillary Clinton is the opposite of change, right? So again, I understand the genesis of the question, but it wasn't for lack of trying. And in fact, Obama did everything he could, through executive action and the things we were proposing: free community college, infrastructure investments. Get right to the heart of how do you promote opportunity in some of these dislocated places. But in our system, you can't do that without Congress. And the obstruction strategy in that way perpetuated some of the economic dislocation that Trump tapped into. That's just the reality. I will say again, though, that explains some of the unease in America. But I do think you can over-explain the election that way. As a narrow political analyst, a matter of political analysis, the two factors that describe why, before you even get into the Russians and James Comey and everything else, the two factors that explain the shift in vote are young people and African Americans did not turn out for Hillary Clinton in the same numbers that they turned out for Barack Obama. I really don't think that has anything to do with wages, and that just has to do with, like, young people and African Americans are more excited about Barack Obama than Hillary Clinton. And then there was another group, though, that is more in this, is these suburban voters and these kind of swing voters. And there I do think some of it was just let's try the Obama-Trump voters. They're people who select people who look like they're going to shake things up, right? And so that I think does more squarely fit into your question. But it wasn't so much like, again, the Democrats lost the rural white voter a while ago, and Barack Obama won. The biggest landslide a Democrat has won since 1964 in 2008, and it's not like he won West Virginia. So I think sometimes we're going to the base Republican voter instead of the swing voter. And for the purpose of elections, you have to understand, I think, the candidates and the swing voters. I will say the lesson for the Democrats there should be, we usually do better if we run somebody who can present themselves as a reformer and as a new face. Barack Obama, Bill Clinton, Jimmy Carter, the last three Democrats to win in my lifetime, were all outsiders, and they're all younger, and they're all on a message of reform, and they all therefore turned out bigger coalitions. Whereas Hillary Clinton, John Kerry, and Al Gore, when we nominate an establishment figure, they get cast as part of this failed elite, and the Republicans know how to run that playbook. So the political lesson, I think, to draw is also one of personality, frankly, as well as message and policy.
Last question, the back there. Thank you.
Only as a follow-up, because the gentleman was nice to already address the financial market issues. Given the over-indebtedness issues, do you see some space for maneuvering of any president, be it the current one, the former one, or the future one, in terms of being even in comparison with the European problems that we're currently facing here in our countries, meaning Italy, France, Germany, to a certain degree as well? Do you see any chances that perhaps this is at all the core principle, the core contradiction, that the voter in the end is not anymore believing the story of the pursuit of happiness, or at least part of the voters? Thanks.
I think that the fundamental problem that is shared across Europe and the United States is that voters feel so distant from the institutions that shape their lives in many ways, and that the institutions feel like they don't work for everybody; they only work for a handful of people. And that message can be, that reality can easily be exploited by a brand of populism on the right or the left, for that matter. And that when you factor in, rising inequality and migration and all these factors, that compounds the sense that institutions don't work. And look, it's difficult for politicians to change that quickly. As I said, we couldn't do everything we wanted because of the structural nature of the U.S. system that, frankly, is probably a good thing. The Founding Fathers created it that way. If Congress doesn't want to pass your bill, they don't pass it, right? And so, therefore, it's hard to be responsive. I do think, though, that how politicians choose to deal with that is important. Obama, yes, we can, right? The reason that resonated is because it made people feel like they should be involved, and that they shouldn't give up on institutions, and they shouldn't give up on politics, and that, again, even when they're frustrated, you can make change, and it's going to be incremental change. It's not going to be everything at once, but we're moving in the right direction, and we're pointed in the right direction, and we're working to get more people healthcare, even if everybody doesn't have it yet, and we're working to bring wages up, even if it's not as fast as everyone would like, and that he defended institutions, he defended democratic process, and look, I'm obviously partisan to this debate, and people can say, well, maybe you should have done it better, but I do think that he was somebody who tried to make people feel like it was worth working from within the existing democracy to bring about change, rather than just being a populist saying we need to tear everything down, which is what Trump does, and to some extent like a Bernie Sanders does. I think here in Europe, it was interesting with Cameron and with Renzi. It's some interesting conversations Obama did that I was in. Cameron kind of acknowledged that part of the problem with Brexit, before he got to it, part of the reason we got to Brexit is that it was really easy for national level politicians to blame Brussels, right? Like, something's not working. Oh man, if only there weren't these bureaucrats in Brussels, like, then things would be really great. It's just, and Renzi said, I remember Obama would give these speeches about Europe in Brussels and Hanover, and to come defending Europe, right? And Renzi said, it's great that you're doing this. The problem is that, to my grandparents' generation, the idea of Europe, that represented kind of liberation from the war. And to my parents' generation, that meant kind of consolidation of the peace and extension of prosperity. And to my generation below, it means bureaucrats and immigrants, And, at the end of the day, there's no substitute for, if you want people to feel less connected from institutions, like, politicians have to make them feel connected to institutions. Again, leadership really matters, and people out making the case for why Europe matters, and people out making the case for why these institutions matter, and not just making them at the Munich Security Conference or at Davos, but making them on campaign trail, and making them on television, and frankly, politics is never going to solve every problem, but not in addition to moving in the right direction, you really need leaders who are willing to make the case to the people that institutions are worth preserving, and institutions are worth fighting for. And I'll end on the stakes here. I mean, and I remember I met a Swiss woman named Flavia Kleiner in Switzerland, who helps run the ballot initiatives. She helps fight the right-wing ballot initiatives. And this started because there's a right-wing ballot initiative in Switzerland last year that said if any foreigner commits a crime, he'd be deported. So even if he's lived there for decades and has family there and kids there, if you get a speeding ticket, you're going to be deported, right? And there'd been a winning streak for these right-wing ballot initiatives. But she got out there and she organized young people and she developed clever media strategies and she developed clever social media strategies. And she was a big part of the reason why they beat this referendum, right? And again, to me, it just shows politics is a human endeavor, right? And you can win or you can lose. And if you don't get into it, you're going to lose. And the stakes here, and this is why I think this should be a case that politicians can make here, can't be overstated, because in those speeches that I mentioned in Hanover and in Brussels and in Estonia, Obama would say, the last 70 years are a freaking miracle, to use an inelegant term. But for all the problems in Europe today, this continent has the highest standard of living in the history of humanity right now, right? For all of the turmoil swirling around, this 70-year period, when was the last time Europe enjoyed 70 or 80 years without a major war, not just World War II and World War I, but, you can go back, Crimean War and Napoleonic Wars, and you all know it better than me, back when you all were living in the Holy Roman Empire, and we didn't even exist in America, right? And I got to tell you, this brand of politics that Trump and the far right in Europe and Brexit represents only leads one place. It has never not resulted in conflict, ever in human history. There will be a war. And it might not be next year, it might not be 2 years. But if this is the direction that things are going, like we know because of this continent more than anywhere else, where that leads. And why would we do that again? You know, and so we need politicians and citizens to fight back against that trend and to defend institutions and defend a set of liberal values. And if that doesn't happen, then you'll lose. But if you do it, you will win. There are more people who believe this, who know this intuitively. But you have to talk to them and make the case to them. And that's what needs to happen in the US and in Europe. Because if the West doesn't do this, it's not going to come from somewhere else.